Hi. Welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the original podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, I'm a programmer at TIFF now, and this is The Other Thing I Do. My guest this week is Robert Connolly, an Australian writer, director, and producer whose features include The Bank, Paper Planes, and The Dry, among others. His latest, Blueback, is a bit of a departure, starring Mia Wasikowska, Radha Mitchell, and Connolly's frequent collaborator Eric Bana in a story about an environmental activist determined to save Australia's coral reef thanks to a childhood meeting with a wonderful little sea creature. It had its world premiere at Toronto last September, and now it's available on digital and on demand across North America. Robert chose The Navigator, a Medieval Odyssey, Vincent Ward's 1988 breakout fantasy about a band of villagers in 14th century England who follow an odd lad named Griffin on a dangerous quest to save their village from the Black Death and find themselves in modern-day New Zealand, where their quest becomes exponentially more dangerous. A time travel movie about faith, hope, and charity, and a very personal apocalypse story, The Navigator was an art house sensation, challenging audiences' ideas of what genre films could be and launching Ward on a fascinating, if frustrating, career. 35 years later, there's still nothing else like it. That's why we're talking about it. This is Someone Else's Movie.
I think you always look at when you chose to become a filmmaker and the films that made you think that cinema could take you on an adventure that transported you thematically and emotionally and visually. And I saw that film when it came out, and I just couldn't quite believe it. I always loved science fiction. So I'd love things that were a bit more fantastical. I'd read science fiction as a young person. 2001: A Space Odyssey had been a massive impact on me as a young boy. And I saw that film, and I didn't feel like, from our part of the world, coming from Australia, and it's a New Zealand film, that we could do films like that. And I think New Zealand cinema has been able to. And it took me on a journey that I found quite lyrical and elliptical and made me contemplate things and puzzle over things. And then, of course, I began the investigation into who Vincent Ward was, and I saw Vigil, which we could talk about that for hours too. It's one of the greatest films ever made. But The Navigator was the one. It kind of spurred something. I then went on to work for 25 years with the producer of The Navigator. I rang him, and I was at film school, and I met him, and I said, "Can you mentor me?" And he said, "Of course." And for 25 years, we worked together, making amazing, amazing films together.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Changed my life, that film, really.
That's wonderful. My experience of it was simply wandering into it at an independent theater a few months after its TIFF premiere. As it turns out, it played here in 1988. I knew it was here, but I missed it, and caught up to it at this great big old single screen house called the Bloor. It's now the Hot Doc Cinema in Toronto, and was just completely enveloped by the formal daring, really. I mean, I think now we're used to it, and I mean, it's not that black and white to color is a new thing. Obviously, it goes back to The Wizard of Oz, and even probably for some short works before that. But the way Ward used it, and the way he just immerses you in the muck of that world and then brings you into the present, is so audacious, especially if you don't know that that's where it's going. And I hadn't paid enough attention to it at the time that it just completely took me by surprise. Yeah,
I think it's you're absolutely right. The audacious nature of it really surprised me, and it made me think storytelling could be whatever I wanted it to be. And also, of course, it's a celebration of what storytelling is. The boy tells a story to save the village from the plague. It's the power of storytelling. Here is a film audacious in form that is also celebrating the very form that it's a part of. It's amazing.
Yeah, I admit it, a huge sucker for movies that treat mythology and fable and faith head on, without any garlanding, I suppose is the term I would use. And Ward sort of does that in his later work too, as the budgets get bigger, and he's capable of doing that sort of thing. But the fact that there is nothing to work with here, that he really just has the dialogue and the performances to sell the whole concept, it's somehow more powerful. I think it's just it's electrifying to watch people wrestle with these things in sort of real time with limited reach and understanding and try to make sense of the world.
I love that you invite me to talk about a film that I love, that I suggest a film and I go, well, maybe you'll know it. You don't only know it, but you've seen it in the cinema. You saw a print of it. I mean, it played at Cannes. It was in competition in Cannes, and then it came to TIFF, and it went on this amazing journey. But isn't that fascinating? It's pretty cool, actually, that you've actually seen the print of it. You know, a 35mm print projected in a cinema of my favorite film. I love that.
Yeah, it's more and more rare these days to be able to stretch back and remember these things on film. And I've seen it, subsequently on disc, and it's fine. It's not that it's lost anything in the transition, but maybe it has, I suppose, the texture of 35, especially with the black and white and the grain. I mean, all of these things are so crucial to the experience, and they were intended to be part of the aesthetic of the film, which is not something you can do anymore unless you're, Damien Chazelle and you have millions of dollars to spend on post-production processing.
Yeah. I think it's a film that warrants like a very serious 4K remaster or scan. I don't think it's been done yet.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it definitely warrants it, because what I'm seeing is a lot of the technology now is capturing more of that sense of the texture of what cinema is and was, and so I think as a film, it kind of begs to be mastered. I don't think it's on the Criterion Collection, is it? They do a pretty good job of mastering a lot of these films.
Arrow has it in the UK. I'm not sure who's got it in North America. The rights were always a bit messy here. Arrow did release a beautiful edition of Vigil.
I love that film.
A couple of years back. And they are sort of in conversation with each other, aren't they? The two earlier.
Yep. When I went to New Zealand for the first time, and I felt like I'd been there before, and I realized I had been there before in Vigil. I'd felt the valley I was in. I'd felt it. The temperature, the color, the atmosphere, the mud, the sky. I'd felt it all. He's a masterful filmmaker, Vincent.
Yeah, I've only met him the one time. He came to TIFF again with River Queen, which is a strange, eccentric sort of indigenous mashup, cultural mashup of indigenous and colonizer cultures with Samantha Morton and Kiefer Sutherland, and it's and he came here and told this remarkable story of having been fired from the film and then brought back on to finish it in post-production, and he was so matter-of-fact about it. I think he was almost amused by it, and it's I couldn't tell talking to him if he was amused at the idea that someone would think they could make a movie of his without him, that they could finish it without him on board, or that he was just amused at the entire process of it, because he had this period where, with Map of the Human Heart and What Dreams May Come, where he was suddenly being courted to make these huge, ambitious films that were basically chasing the high of The Navigator. I mean, even Alien 3, right? He was part of the production early on that, where people were just offering him these gargantuan projects, and he figured out ways to make them work. And then they found tiny, loyal audiences of the two films he actually got made in the 90s, while still kind of alienating most mass audience responses. He's this fantastically specific filmmaker. You can point to anything he does and know it's him, but he's also completely resistant to popular success somehow. Yeah,
I know. It's a fascinating challenge for any filmmaker, I guess, how personal and idiosyncratic you want your work to be and your point of view to be, and a world that kind of expects that. It expects you to be distinctive, but also audiences that actually enjoy genre tropes, celebrity. They enjoy a bit of chutzpah in the filmmaking, and so which Vincent, of course, has. But it's this kind of balancing act. And some filmmakers, an Australian filmmaker like Baz Luhrmann, just knows how to do it. He knows how to juggle all those balls and get mass audiences to see his idiosyncratic work, whatever you think of it. And then you've got other filmmakers, and I think Vincent's probably one of them, that, in many ways, his films do speak of big universal things, and they, like What Dreams May Come, in lots of ways, could have been a more commercial film than it probably was, because it had big movie star in the lead, and it had a visual ambition that I thought was pretty awesome, pretty original.
Yeah.
We love the originality, and we want a little bit of this commerciality at the same time. It's such a contradiction often.
It is, and it's the thing that I think even he wrestles with here and there. He clearly wants these films to break out. I mean, they're fables, right? He's telling the most simple form of story, really, and it's always, a person goes on a journey. That's the. I mean, you could. I wish I could remember who it was. Maybe it was Dashiell Hammett who said that all of fiction can be reduced to someone goes on a journey or a stranger comes to town. There's really the only. There's just that. Yeah. But his are always about people moving outwards, which I find compelling and fascinating in their own way.
Yeah, they're kind of quite epic in that regard. The journey Robin Williams goes on to find his wife in What Dreams May Come, or, this boy leading these people into the present in this amazing tour de force of originality in The Navigator. You're absolutely right, that kind of the epic. And that's what I guess I loved when I saw the film, was this sense of, stories can be, big. I mean, I'd been taken to this little eccentric cinema in Sydney run by the Hare Krishnas, and you could go and see a film there and they'd give you a meal. And my dad took me there when I was young to see The Seventh Seal, and I hadn't seen any Bergman at that point, and I wasn't even considering being a filmmaker. And he said, I want to show you my favourite film. And so we go and see that film. There are elements of the influence of that film on Vincent, which you see really clearly in The Navigator. So years later, if I think of these films percolating, my mother takes my brother and I off to see, this terrible documentary, The Bible is History, two good Catholic boys go and learn about how a terrible documentary. And we were very little, and we had to travel on a train for 2 hours to get there. And then my mum realised we'd been so well behaved, she took us down the road to see 2001: A Space Odyssey, which blew my brain. So, which has an interesting structural conceit in its storytelling.
Yeah.
Like the cryptic nature of it. So,
well, I was going to say it's a religious experience in its own right.
It was a much bigger religious experience than learning about the Bible as history. But, I can feel as a young creative person forming my thinking. My father showing me The Seventh Seal, my mum taking me to 2001, and, this is in the 70s. And, by the 80s, I'm finishing school and going to film school, and then starting to see films, and The Navigator comes along, and it's made by a New Zealand filmmaker close to home. And it feels like it's got all of the ambition of these big auteurs, these big global auteurs. And it's no surprise that Vincent, both Vigil and The Navigator, were both in competition in Cannes 1 year after the other. I mean, he is a superb and ambitious filmmaker. And in lots of ways, I wish there were more films that you and I could talk about that he'd made. He has been doing some visual art, actually, and having exhibitions of his work in New Zealand and focusing a lot of visual art. And I think he's finishing a film at the moment.
I had heard he'd moved away from feature development at one point, but maybe 10 years ago. But I'm not even sure where I'd heard that. It's just one of those things you sort of casually hear this person's name and it's like, oh, that's right. I love his work. Yeah. Where is he?
Yeah, that's right. But I think we'll see more of him. I feel like his, work kind of stands the test of time. And I think Vigil for me, although I wanted to talk about The Navigator because it's more of a specific influence, and it was the first of his films that I saw. When I went back and saw Vigil, I kind of was gobsmacked by its capacity to evoke landscape. And, like my recent films, The Dry and the sequel to The Dry Force of Nature, in both of those cases, I showed Vigil to all of the heads of departments before we made those films.
Ah.
And I said, this is the boldness of landscape that we need to be reaching for. John Maynard says, the producer of Vigil and the Navigator, and also Jane Campion Sweetie, an amazing, figure in world cinema himself. He always said, you want that feeling of landscape in Vigil. Well, the way we did it was we filmed for 4 months. We only shot a little bit every day. They had people waiting on the tops of the valley looking out. And if the sun was breaking, they stopped filming, and they were able to, they built the little town. They brought the ducks in that you see, and he said often cinema now has a model much more like television. It's kind of all contracted. You shoot very fast, and that's largely driven by actor availability. So you have a culture that needs celebrities. Celebrity actors have managers and agents. They want them to work as much as they can. They tell you can have this actor, but you can only have them for 3 weeks. Everything contracts into, whereas cinema as an art form requires space and exploration. And, I always describe it as, reaching for a feeling on set that you're splashing paint on a canvas every day. And it's very hard to do that in an industrial process like filmmaking. But I think when you look at Vigil, it definitely was made in a different way to how contemporary cinema is. Right?
Well, I think about how watchful it feels, even compared to the Navigator, which is much more frenzied. I mean, obviously, there's a plague going on, there's impending death, and the whole culture shock of it is going to push it sort of spikes the adrenaline level fairly early on. Yeah. And Vigil, just title alone, right? I mean, it tells you you're going to see something deliberate and patient and contemplative. But of course, if you shoot it that way, you're going to capture that as well, right? Yes. The unhurried pace of it just translates into the frame somehow.
That's right. That's right. I wonder, and I've pondered this a lot in the new world order of streaming. And, my film, The Dry, which very successfully released in the US by IFC, but very early on, Netflix viewed the film and said, it's too slow. Our audience will find it too slow. And, of course, by the time it plays on Netflix, it opens at number 1. It does very well. But their perception is our audiences on the small screen need things to be faster. They need more narrative, which is a discussion that you have when you direct television, not cinema. Because with cinema, an audience has paid the money. They're in the cinema. They're not going to leave in the first 10 minutes. You can take a little bit of time settling them in. I love that as a narrative structure. But it makes me ponder whether we're looking at a different aesthetic that we'll start for the years from now we'll feel. And I'm guilty of it myself, watching things on Netflix, I'm tired, or on other streaming platforms. And if it doesn't capture me, it's like, I'll watch something else. So the way people consume on those platforms is a bit more with an expectation of a different engagement. But cinema has the great joy of establishing the rhythm and then surprising you with a great dynamic shape to the film as you progress into it. And Vincent's film, again, it's a meditative film, but that has great emotional legs and foreign stages that really stay with you for many years and forever.
Yeah.
Like great art should.
I'm always shocked when Netflix sort of presumes to explain how cinema works when their entire model is devoted to oversaturation and to having what is even the right term? Having an incalculable signal to noise ratio. I mean, you're flipping through tiles longer than it will take you to watch anything you will eventually choose to watch, or you know exactly what you want and then you go get it. If it's there, that's great. But the model is always designed to keep you watching. So they'll do an entire season of television, which is a prequel to the show they want to make. Like it all ends with the pieces in place to have a really great second season, or demand that a show run 12 or 15 episodes. Well, I guess those are unreasonable numbers now, but something can be 10 episodes when it should be 8, or 12 episodes when it should be 6. And so many of these projects are clearly features that were converted to television structures because that's how you sell them. And then you're stuck with repetitive episodes or scenes that don't even need to be there. And all the fat, all the extra flesh on these things is exhausting. And finding a movie and watching a movie somehow is the thing they least want you to do, because it is a one and done. Unless it's their movie that week, they're just not interested.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I know. I think it was the Coen brothers said, someone was asking them, they dabbled in television, what they thought of TV, and they said, "Well, we like endings. We like the end of stories, and television's about a beginning and a middle and a middle and a middle and a middle." And some people like that. They like that narrative experience, and they can delve into something and allow the second act or the middle just to go on and on and on and complicate. And I've been in those writers' rooms, and people coming up with plot. And you've got a character that should be incidental, and everyone's throwing stuff at you, and you're kind of fleshing it out, and it becomes all of the white noise around the film. And we know that in some certain works of television, that is extraordinary.
Yeah,
and
it can be.
You can inhabit that world for years, like a Mad Men or a Sopranos or Succession, or the massive success of The Last of Us in recent weeks. And people and the incredible boldness of form of that, actually, in its narrative form.
Yep.
But a lot of the time, it's like soap for me. You've got to be the type of person that. I'm kind of with the Coen brothers. I like an ending. Like, I like a novel, and you begin reading a novel, and the author has worked out how it will conclude. I remember picking up at the airport. I was traveling from some festival, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, and I knew nothing about it. And I started reading it, and I read it, and I got off the plane, and I got the taxi home, and it was in the dark at home, the whole family, and I'm crying at 3:00 in the morning as I finished the book. That's the experience I crave. An author took me on a journey from the beginning. Someone goes on a journey, you'll know.
Yeah.
Quite a big journey.
It's a big one.
And a middle that is, very emotional, and then concludes it. And the last page of that book I've read 100 times to try and comprehend. It's such a beautiful resolution, the way he describes the fish in the water and what humanity's lost. And so that's the thing with narrative form of cinema, which is why I love it and why I feel it can be consumed like a great book that you actually you start and you end. And that's why I love watching films in the cinema. That's why I love that you saw The Navigator in the cinema. I wasn't expecting it. It's like because no. I did too. I remember the cinema in Sydney. I remember the feeling of what coming out and going, "Oh my Lord, that was staggering work." But that's where I think people miss it. They think cinema is just about seeing things on the big screen as opposed to a small screen. Well, people have massive cinemas and massive audio, and no, cinema is about choosing to go out to something. It's about buying the tickets. It's about the expectation. It's about turning up and having a glass of wine and popcorn, and it's about sitting down.
Hey, it's Norm interrupting my own show to bring you up to speed on Shiny Things, my twice-weekly newsletter about physical media, culture, and the Odd Streaming Project. Titles to be covered this week include Criterion's new editions of Peter Bogdanovich's Targets and Celine Sciamma's Petit Maman, John Woo's long-lost Jackie Chan film Hand of Death, and Shohei Imamura's Warm Water Under a Red Bridge, which is finally out on Blu-ray. Sign up for a 14-day free trial at shiny-things.ghost.io or find a link at the Semcast Twitter account. You like reading about movies, right? Come check it out.
Yeah, I actually really surprisingly, because it was over the break and I was trying to not think about film, but someone gave me Tarantino's book, Cinema Speculation.
Oh, yeah.
And I just devoured it. It's about him and the films in the 70s that he loved. And it's him kind of rambling about where he saw them, how he saw them, his mum sneaking him in, why they're important. And then this kind of fanboy love of them from a great auteur. And it just felt like such a celebration of, and some of them were films that were available in the video shops, but all the ones he describes were moments where he watched them in the cinema.
Yeah, and that has to change your relationship to the material. I think it's
absolutely.
Spielberg calls movie theaters halls of worship, right, where we all go and point in the same direction and share the same dream. And it's flowery, but it's like literally true that the alpha state of cinema, of watching a movie, is a sort of hypnosis. It's a sort of conscious dreaming, and we all interpret it differently, which is the thing I love the most about it. 400 people will be in a room having the exact same experience, and every one of them will come out with a different take on it.
Yeah.
Some of them will obviously be wrong, but the ones who agree with me, I'm happy about those. But it's like nothing else. We don't have another medium like this. There's music, which is, similar, and theater, which is dependent on the audience in a way that film isn't. I think to find the energy and share it in a room. But I keep coming back to the movies because they're my thing. They always have been. My grandfather owned a movie theater when I was a kid, so I had no chance at a normal life. You grow up in a projection booth, and it's just like, oh, I know these things. I love this stuff. More, please.
Yeah.
And over the break, I admit it, I upgraded my home theater too. I've got 4K and Atmos here, and it's very comfortable, and nice and warm, and all of that. But it's not a movie theater. It's not a hall the same way. It's just not as. It's somehow, even though it's my own home, it's not as intimate as a cinema. And I really do wonder what somebody like Ward, who makes films for the big screen. And I hadn't realized the connection between the production connection on his early films and Sweetie, because Sweetie and The Navigator are tied very tightly together in my mind as well.
They came out a year apart.
I know.
I think John might have produced Vigil, Sweetie, then The Navigator, all three in competition in Cannes, 1 year after the other. I think that's how it worked. And he was a young producer. He'd run a very innovative art gallery, the Govett Brewster Gallery in New Plymouth in New Zealand. And as a young man, he was Australian, but he'd done incredible work there. And I think he gravitated to filmmakers as artists. And Vincent had made a very bold film called In One Glance Alone. And I guess Jane Campion had made her great short films, Peel of which was staggering. They also worked with Alison McLean. John's partner. Yeah, Crush.
Yes,
John's partner, Bridget Eichen. So John produced Sweetie, and then Bridget produced An Angel at My Table. And John was one of the producers on that too. And as a couple, Bridget had produced the incredible short film Kitchen Sink, which was Alison, which I saw in a cinema as the short film before Sweetie. So the similar time, I'm working in theatre. I'm a theatre director, not a filmmaker. I go to the cinema. There's this incredible short film, Kitchen Sink. Oh, my Lord. Then after that, I watch Sweetie, which is a precursor to all of that Australian comedy. If you look at it, it's before Strictly Ballroom, Muriel's Wedding, Priscilla, that kind of suburban satire that you get in Muriel's Wedding. I mean, you look back, Sweetie was the seminal film.
Yeah.
And of course...
it's just not funny, so of course people are, they rarely. Right. I mean, it's sort of funny, but it's the garishness and the visual palette, those intense colors and strange American sitcom look that somehow translates wrong because the light is different, which I just think is absolutely fascinating. Yeah, you're right. I never thought about
it. So when you think of producers, and I direct and produce, and my company's championing all manner of filmmakers as well as my own work. And you have to kind of go, well, what were they? They were doing something special, but those films were all extraordinary. So I was at film school and I reached out to John Maynard because I'd seen his name on these films, those three films, Vigil, The Navigator, and Sweetie. And because I thought, okay, there's something going on here. It's great. There's a great, and Angel on My Table's worth a revisit too if you haven't seen it for a while. It's really interesting. Narrative structure with the three acts. It was made for television, and then they released it as a film. But yeah, a very formative time for me. where art house cinema actually, the cinema in the heart of Sydney, part of the Sydney CBD called Martin Place, and there was a cinema, and it was kind of where you'd go on a date, as a 19, 20-year-old, and you'd go and see whatever was on. Like you wouldn't actually choose. And it wasn't like there was another cinema, the Valhalla, which was more an art house cinema that would play Koyana Squadsi and everyone would get stoned and go and watch that. Or it was kind of that. But whereas the one in Martin Place was more curated. And
right.
You'd go there and see. I remember seeing Once Were Warriors there, actually, and coming out, and everyone was just sitting around just overwhelmed by that film.
God, it would be nice to be able to experience that and be closer to it. I mean, obviously those films will hit home differently in Australian theaters than they would in New Zealand theaters too, right? Than they would here. Here they were always sort of abstracted. And, Canada is a nation with its own Indigenous population and its own Indigenous issues and tensions, but somehow I think it always feels just so completely different. The landscape is different. The textures are different. It felt like a transmission from another. I mean, it felt like what it was. It felt like a film from the other side of the world.
Yeah.
And to relate to it on a personal level, I mean, how would that work? Do they feel contemporary in the moment when you're watching them?
I think so. I think when I remember it, I felt like the cinema felt very vital, like very. It didn't feel like something that old people went to. It felt a bit more punk or something, like that you went there and cinema, it had an edge to it. And so you'd go there and you'd be seeing a work and you'd talk about it afterwards and engage with it in a way. And these are quite political works in some ways as well.
Oh, yeah.
And a very controversial scene in The Navigator, which I read interviews, I think, various critics pushed Vincent on why he did it, but there's a moment where they've made their way from the Black Plague into modern-day New Zealand, and they're looking in the window and all these TVs have got this ad, a very powerful ad with the Grim Reaper at the heart of HIV and AIDS. And it was a very effective advertising campaign, but people said he didn't need to make the connection for the audience, that there was currently a parallel connection that he could draw. He got criticised for that, actually. And I remember some critics just took offence to it, or felt like it was unnecessary. But I think it was a really bold choice. It kind of made the film feel here and now. At that moment, that ad was playing.
Well, and it also gives the characters from the 14th century something to connect to in the present. That to see the iconography of death and plague, and further convince them that they are still in the same world. I mean, I love the adjustment. Right. They simply assume that big cities have these things that they've never been able to experience before.
Yeah.
And it nicely gets around the sense of, I would say, terror that we would have being thrust into the future, where you would have absolutely no way to negotiate anything that you didn't recognize. The joke, there was a David Letterman joke right around the same time about, the 5 things that Abraham Lincoln would say today. And one of them was, Iron Bird. And
yeah,
because how would you even cope? And here there's this innocence that the characters have. And it is, I suppose on another interpretation, it's just ignorance, where they simply they're not smart enough to understand the concept of moving forward through centuries. But the way that it happens, that sort of naturalistic accident of just popping up in the wrong time period, and going with it, somehow plays to me as even more convincing. It's the thing that sells it. If there had been a moment where someone tries to explain it, it wouldn't work.
Yeah. It's not a literal thing, is it? He's reaching for some idea that this young boy might just be telling a story about to them, and that they're all listening, and
it just flows that way.
They don't physically make that transition. They imagine a future, and there's a great device. I'm just rereading a book, John Wyndham's The Chrysalids, a book I read when I was much younger, sci-fi in there. It has a great conceit in it, that it begins with set in a world 1,000 years from now, and you think that they're talking about the past, and this place and the city, and but actually they're imagining a future that is real. And I think those devices, like you're describing, go best unexplained because it's fun, isn't it, as an audience?
Yeah.
It's fun. It's like you can take people out of the cinema afterwards and you can probably have a disagreement about whether it was a flashback or a flash forward, or, whether it was imagined or real. You can imagine the script notes. Yeah, but how do they travel to the future? We need an environmental cataclysm that some people can understand as a
Right.
scientific. No, these guys just burrow through the earth and come up in modern day New Zealand. They're unexplained. And,
Yeah. Why wouldn't they? I mean, that's how that works.
For your listeners who haven't seen the film, it'll be a real, because it's a very commercial film. It won all the Australian Film Institute awards. It made a lot of money at the box office. Actually, a very commercial film. And even by today's standards, it would stack up.
Yeah, I mean, it played around the world. It was very well received, I think. I mean, I only remember the positives 30 odd years later, but it holds up narratively, and there's nothing in it because, it's set in 1988. Well, when they finally get there, it doesn't feel like an imagined future. It's just nuts and bolts, whatever was in front of the camera.
Yeah.
So your brain accepts it more easily. Yeah. It's strange. It's why, science fiction and I think why genre films from the 80s and 90s have held up very well is the only thing that dates about them are the hairstyles. The imagination doesn't change. You're still shooting for more than you can possibly deliver and telling the story with as much as you can muster.
Yeah. New Zealand. I always felt back then, trying to develop my own films early in my career, that New Zealand did have more of a sense of a non-naturalistic boldness, and Australia was a bit trapped. I mean, we'd had all the genre films, and there'd been this point where George Miller had made Mad Max and Peter Weir had made Picnic at Hanging Rock, and the industry, it's kind of split a little, but an Australian naturalism set in. And I think New Zealand cinema was able to make films like The Navigator. The other film, of course, is The Quiet Earth.
That's exactly what I was about to mention, yeah.
Great film of that time, and very simple idea. Last Man on Earth story. Again, great genre. A well-explored genre and a very good New Zealand spin on it.
That's another one that I was lucky enough to see at the Bloor, too. I think the Bloor was the art house I went to the most often as a teenager.
The equivalent of our cinema.
It sounds like it, yeah. Smack in the middle of the Annex, which is our college neighborhood where University of Toronto is and where most of the students end up. And you would just go there, see whatever, and then go to the restaurant across the road and spend hours breaking things down and talking them over. And I remember The Quiet Earth was one where nobody was even hungry afterwards. We all just wanted to go out and stand around for a while.
It's worth reading the book it's based on, actually.
I never have, yeah.
Well, because it explains things a bit more. I can never tell whether that's a good thing or not, because after 2001: A Space Odyssey, I went and read Arthur C. Clarke's the short story and then the book, and then, of course, he wrote 2010 and then 2016. And all of a sudden, something that's like unexplained it's a reductive process of making it real. But I do remember in the book there's a great moment, because, of course, everyone disappears on Earth, but there's one moment in the film where these scientists are experimenting with mice, and they come back in and the cage is locked and the mice are all gone. And it's a kind of forewarning that whatever they're doing could lead to the entire human race disappearing in a moment. And I love those sci-fi tropes. It's like unexplored territory for me, directing sci-fi. I've been directing for 25 years. My first film, The Bank, which played at TIFF, and was produced by John Maynard, who produced those films, had a very scientific bent of a man predicting the stock market using chaos theory and fractal theory. But I think science fiction is one area that I just put it on the bucket list at some point. Come on, I've got to. It's a passion, Got to find the right work to do.
Yeah, I mean, These Final Hours, which you produced, comes close, right? Yeah. I mean, it's an apocalypse story.
Yeah, I'm so proud of that film, and I kind of more mentored those guys on that. I mean, Zach and Liz, and I loved its ambition, reaching. And I think we're starting to see a lot of Australian filmmakers that are. We've been very strong in horror for quite a few years now.
Oh, yeah.
But I Am Mother. There are a few filmmakers that are younger filmmakers that are coming through and getting opportunities now. And of course, Jennifer Kent's The Babadook in the horror space,
Sure.
just pushing out of the naturalism a bit. But yeah, you're right. These Final Hours had that. You get a good end of the world story. The Last Day on Earth story. That's a good genre.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. I was going to say you can't go wrong, but of course you can. There's always going to be a bad one. But when I think about Don McKellar's Last Night here in Canada, where he imagined a very polite end of the world, because that's who we are, or who we believe ourselves to be anyway.
Yeah.
And having revisited that a couple of years ago, it's remarkable how well it holds up and how much it says about Toronto, specifically Toronto culture at the time. But it's also a very white film by necessity, I think, in 1998, but now it doesn't even feel like Toronto anymore because things have become so much more multicultural, both in the city visibly and in terms of the people making the entertainment. So if you're trying to picture a version of it now, you just have so many more people to choose from, so much more of a cast to build on, and entirely different cultures that would be experiencing this event in the same way. And I think that's where science fiction becomes really fascinating too, because it is always about asking what if, but it's also always about what's happening right now. And so you'd see the intersection becoming just more and more vital as you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
the more political it is, the better. The more it's about us, the better.
Yeah.
I've never really been fantasy. I was more erred on the science fiction side. I'm less Lord of the Rings and more towards the more robust, solid science fiction. But you look at the great authors from H.G. Wells right through that have spoken about what was going on in the world at that moment. And the science fiction always speaks of, from George Orwell writing 1984 in 1948, just flipping the numbers, to be hypothetical. But it's wonderful how cinema's a great space for science fiction. It's great. So the only problem is the spectacle of cinema has become a bit irritating. But I feel like Marvel films have, I think once dinosaurs walked on Earth again so effectively in the first Jurassic Park, you could see anything. So that's why a film like Ex Machina works so well, because it's not about the spectacle. It's just an intellectually interesting, work with a couple of tour de force performances. And so the spectacle kind of limits emerging filmmakers from thinking they can make science fiction, because you think you've got to have the epic scale of Dune, the beautiful digital matte paintings of Dune. But I always think that they're little boutique, like The Quiet Earth. It's interesting.
Yeah,
do a remake that film.
I wonder if you could. I mean, the biggest effects involved are just clearing space, right, and making sure there's nothing in the frame.
Yeah,
and I mean, you mentioned Ex Machina, and I think that the greatest effects in that film are in the actors' faces. I mean, yes, there's the suit that Alicia Vikander is wearing, but that's something your brain just sort of accepts after a few minutes, and they probably found ways to cheat it just to save money and not have to do a CGI brain or anything. But it is really about watching, just the conversation, the ideas going back and forth. Yeah.
And that scene where Oscar Isaac dances with Android. I mean, hey, you just got to have a couple of, what is it, Martin Scorsese said every film needs 4 great scenes.
Oh, yeah.
You've got to look at your film and make sure you got 4. You don't need 40.
Yeah.
You've got to find 4.
I think he was riffing
really
on,
great scenes.
Yeah, because Billy Wilder said 3 great scenes and no bad ones. That was the rule.
Okay, is that right?
And Scorsese, I can see him topping it with 4. I can see him going.
Yeah, going. Billy Wilder could get away with 3. It's like,
I hold myself to a higher standard.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's a fascinating conundrum, really, for the stories we want to see. I think all streaming services have unlocked a fascination with genre. And science fiction does very well on streaming.
Yeah. It's the junk food, right? It's the stuff that we come home and crave.
Yeah. Guilty pleasure stories are often underrated, and guilty pleasure stories that are told by great auteurs with really interesting points of view and great performances can really surprise you. Yeah, but I've never really, I know Vincent, but I've never asked him where the idea came from with the Navigator. I've never asked how he, but curious, he went to America and worked on Alien 3.
Mm-hmm. And wanted a wood planet filled with monks, and you can just sort of see pieces of it survive. I would love to. He wouldn't talk about it. I broached it when we met, and he just wasn't. Well, let's talk about the movie I've just made. Let's talk about the present day. And I was like, but I want to know.
Yeah.
He did say that the Navigator comes from an incident in his own life where he tried to cross an Autobahn in Germany and got stuck. Just couldn't make it across and got trapped in the middle. I think on an
island.
An island, yes.
Yeah.
And just trying to figure out how he could time himself to get across. Started thinking about what it would be like if someone with no knowledge of cars found themselves on the space. And supposedly that's where it came from.
Okay, that's good.
But so much more, and too, when we're talking about how stripped down genre can be and how you don't need a lot. I do find it fascinating that the most expensive aspect of that movie was the period wardrobe for the characters, right? Like,
yeah.
It's science fiction about the present.
Yeah, that's right. Just set in the contemporary, and you take people from the past. Time travel, offers great paradoxes and complexity. And we've just had a film win all the Academy Awards this year in this genre space. It's fascinating to see, films of a popular nature working in that genre space actually, being so innovative and kind of celebrated.
Yeah, and very similar to Ward's films, they're done by hand. I mean, those are the most. I think they had a team of something like 4 or 5 people working on most of the VFX. It was incredibly small, and just the explainer videos they've done on how they pulled off some of the metaverse shots of Michelle Yeoh just falling backwards through things, and it really is just a bunch of Polaroids at high speed or something. It's the most basic and cobbled together things, but because the film's aesthetic puts you in that mind space, it all plays. And because the story is about people fighting for people they love, of course it all plays.
I did hear the story from John Maynard about the moment in the Navigator when the stick that's burning falls from and from the black and white world into the color world.
Yes.
And the VFX guy was a special effects guy, and they literally painted a metal drum with the rocks on the wall, and they in black and white, and you could turn it like this, and then had in front of it the burning bit of wood with 2 bits of string, and then they filmed it. So you got someone doing this with the drum. I love that. I mean, my last film that played at Toronto has a puppet in it. It's a fish. It's a very expensive puppet, but I've always enjoyed the mechanics of that stuff. It's not a cartoon. I think sometimes the hyper photorealistic digital animations are like an animation, like a digital animation, and really good and incredible and done by great artists. And they'll be done by AI soon. So you'll just say, I need a background, and it'll generate one for you. Whereas I like the kind of practical effects.
Oh yeah, no, you got to have something for the actors to see and touch. The AI backgrounds will be given away. They'll give themselves away immediately because they'll all have 6 fingers or something. They can't do fingers and they can't do teeth. It's very disturbing.
Is that right?
Yeah, apparently it's still the best way to see if something is. The quickest way to see if something is fake is to just look at the eyes, the teeth, and the fingers.
Right. Isn't that fascinating?
Which I think like some basic predator-prey instinct that we all have, where you see if someone's smiling or menacing, and then you see if there's a weapon in their hand, some lizard brain thing. And naturally, that's the thing that computers fall down on.
Wow. Yeah, significant moment in history. On this recce that I'm on now, flying on the plane, I had the internet, and I hadn't used an AI before, and I got on one, and I thought I'm flying between Australia and Dublin on this trip at that time, and I'm on my laptop, and I'm conversing with this AI, and I was testing it, and I got it to write some pages of a script for me. I said, a couple walking across Sydney Harbour Bridge, they haven't seen each other for years. They don't talk, but they hold hands. That's all I said. I said, give me the first page of the script. Boom, this page. And the thing that surprised me was the imagery was really strong. It was detail, and it ended with, and as they walk off, not speaking, holding hands, he looks out across the Sydney Harbour and the light refracting. I mean, the thing that my daughter pointed out to me was I mentioned no gender in my brief.
Okay.
But the gender bias was that it wrote a page of a script where the protagonist was male and the antagonist was female. So, this issue of gender bias that we fight against in all our creative, is fascinating. I know we're talking off topic here, aren't we? But hey,
it's all evolutionary. It's fine. But I was going to ask if there was something, and we sort of have covered it, but if there was something from the Navigator, or even Ward's other works that you've used yourself, have borrowed or cited or outright stolen for your own work. I don't really see anything, but I mean, I'm always...
No, I like parallel time frames, and I think all my works have them. And that, I have this kind of feeling in life that, someone early in my 20s talked to me about, a study of how much of any day does someone think about the present, the past, or the future? And we're kind of in equal measure, really, unless we're highly evolved and, are really good at mindfulness and meditation. We pretty much only spend about a third of the day thinking about the present and the past and the future. So cinema does this really well. I think cinema allows you to move between time frames, and flashbacks have a bad name. People go, they have a bad name because they're often just used for narrative exposition. But I think what Vincent did in the two time frames would be something that I loved. I hadn't even formed my philosophical approach to filmmaking at that time, but it was definitely something that I really loved. And I think in my work, I would probably say there's some influence there of Vincent in terms of him doing a massive big time jump and then moving back at the end and framing the story. And then not only moving back, but almost then when he goes back, not even acknowledging whether the future was a dream. Is it the future? Did they go to the future? Is it some fictional, imagination? But nothing more specific than that, really. I mean, I would say that, and then, of course, the other massive influence is landscape and visual.
Right.
And the Dry trilogy that I'm doing at the moment, each of the three, I've done two of them, and exploring, adapting the third that concludes the trilogy, but they're all set in completely different natural environments. And I think definitely there is no comparable filmmaker that I can think of that captured landscape as well as Vincent did in visual. And there's some pretty amazing filmmakers that have captured landscape, but I think that's sublime. That film is sublime.
It is. It's absolutely.
That's influence is incredible. I mean,
yeah, it's a wonderful thing. I'm so glad we got to talk about that as well as the Navigator. I mean, have you ever been tempted to just have some 14th century peasants pop up out of a hole in one of your films, just off in the distance? It doesn't have to be the focus, but just any sort of throwaway.
I haven't been, but it's funny now that you say it. It feels like it would be incomplete in my career not to pay some quite significant homage to Vincent's work. And so watch this space. You'll be the first person to pick it. You'll be like, okay, I'll do it in my next film just for you. Just something in the background that you'll go, okay, that's what he's doing.
My thanks to Robert Connolly, whose new film Blueback is available on digital and on demand across North America right now. Thanks also to Ali Lemaire Shedden. She knows what she did. Robert's not on Twitter, but you can find The Navigator on Blu-ray from Arrow Video in the UK, US, and Canada, and from Umbrella Entertainment in Australia. It's also streaming on Tubi in the US and Canada, and on Canopy and Arrow in the US, and available to rent or buy on various VOD platforms. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Norm Wilner, and you can find this podcast there at Semcast, SEMcast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. The first year of the show is still available for just $20 at payhip.com/semcast. That's the first 52 episodes of Someone Else's Movie, 44 of which aren't currently available anywhere else. And check out my newsletter, Shiny Things, at shiny-things.ghost.io. I think you'll enjoy it. Our theme song is by The Last Year. If you like it, or the show in general, please say so. Leave a review wherever you've been listening. Every little bit helps. It truly does. And check out the other shows on the Frequency Podcast Network while you're doing that. Stay safe, watch movies, wear a mask if you go out, get your booster when you can. I'll see you next week.